I'm going to be speaking today about teaching in Finland, Taiwan, and Greece. I've got other countries that I'm going to be visiting, and you may ask, well, why these particular countries? I've chosen these countries because I've been looking at the only sort of clear quantitative measure that's available for how students succeed internationally, and that is the infamous PISA test. It's a test that's administered to students all over the world in 65 countries, and it's often trotted out as a kind of, as a way of either reprimanding some countries or praising other countries for the success that they've had in getting students to perform well, to be successful. Given that what my hypothesis for this study was, and actually why should I keep you in the dark about that for so long, my hypothesis, or my organizing question, was this one: is there any kind of correlation between the prestige of the teaching profession within a given culture and the performance of students? And as I say, I chose to look at these PISA test scores as an entry point into selecting the countries. So I've chosen countries that are very high scores on the PISA tests, those who sort of fall in the middle, like the United States, which is actually a seventh country that I'm doing, that is included in the study, and then those that are performing at the bottom of these PISA scores. The second sort of ancillary part of my question is if there is a correlation between how cultures perceive their teachers and how students perform, where does that prestige derive, or how is it expressed? Where does it come from? Is it historical? Is it something that you can develop within a culture that hasn't historically had a respect for its teachers? These are all sort of the driving questions behind my research. I started out, as I said, in the place that has gotten all of the publicity in the last few years for its meteoric rise on this scale of the PISA test scores, and that's Finland. It's been covered so much in the press that Finland moved from the late 1980s, early 1990s, when it was a fairly mediocre performer on these international tests. It zoomed to the top. So in the last 3 or 4 years, when the tests have been administered, Finland always is in the top 5, at least. So there's been much written about the miracle of the Finland, the rehabilitation of the Finland school system. And so it was an obvious place for me to begin. I began by looking at how Finland changed itself into a top-scoring country. And one thing that it clearly did was that it engaged in radical school reform. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Finland experienced a terrible recession. And the response to the recession was not to cut, but to reallocate funds into the public school. Teacher pay went way up. Teaching became much more of a difficult entry profession. In the past, you could start teaching immediately with a BA and some courses that you took in Finland. After the reform measures of the late 90s and early 2000s, you couldn't even begin to think about becoming a teacher unless you had a master's degree, and this was a research-based master's degree. And even then, the jobs were incredibly competitive. It was harder to get, it still is, it's harder to get into a teacher education program in Finland than it is to get into medical school. So that gives you a sense of just how much the cream of the crop is going into the profession. Now, they couldn't attract people into the profession in Finland by simply making it difficult to get into it and raising the pay. And I have to say, nobody makes a lot of money in Finland, but the pay for teachers is equivalent to the pay for doctors or the pay for lawyers. It's a true profession. Many have said that in the U.S., teaching is really just a semi-profession. It doesn't have all of the neither the status nor the characteristics of the other white-collar profession. But they also reduced the number of teaching hours in Finland quite dramatically, so that teachers teach now maybe 2 to 3 hours a day, tops. The rest of the time is spent for teachers to create their own curriculum. And this, again, is another characteristic of a real profession where you have control over the material that you work with. It's not a kind of top-down system in Finland. So the teachers within the school, I was looking at an English teacher, they develop their own curriculum within the school, and teachers write the textbooks in Finland too. So there's a real sense of ownership of what you're teaching, and of course, logically, if you feel a connection to what you're teaching, you're going to teach it better. The quality of teacher education has really gone up dramatically in Finland. Students spend long periods of time in the classrooms. Students of teaching, people who are interested in becoming teachers, spend long periods of time in the classrooms of practicing teachers who have been chosen by the universities to be model teachers for them. So there's not a danger of a student teacher being put in a classroom with a teacher who's a kind of indifferent teacher. The byword of all teaching in Finland is collaboration. And again, in a country that's essentially a socialist country, the thinking is if you want people to become good citizens within a socialist system, you have to teach them in the schools how to collaborate and how to see themselves as part of to subordinate their own desires or their own ego to others. So every classroom that I saw in this particular school, everything is done collaboratively. I never saw a classroom where there were rows of desks. And that person over there in the middle is Annika. I'll show you another picture of her. She's the teacher. She's a 17-year veteran teacher who's always taught in this one school in Tampere. And I would say as an aside that you know that teachers are happy when they have spent long periods of time in one school and haven't moved around from school to school. Students do all their work together. They always have a choice. She always begins the lesson by saying, you can now do this exercise, you can do it on your own, or you can do it with your colleagues. It's your choice. There's so much choice in the Finnish system. And there was a lot of discussion among the teachers I spoke to about their relationships with the students, and that it's not that they see themselves as friends to the students, but there's a very easygoing, open relationship. I was surprised that Annika was called Annika by her students, but there was certainly a respect that was being directed towards her. And she, as students worked, she would go around and she seemed to know everybody and make little inside jokes to people, and there was just a good feeling in the room. And you can see also, it may not look exceptional to you, but you'll see when I show you some of the other schools that the classrooms themselves are cheerful. And the other thing that is characteristic of not only her school, but I did visit 2 other schools when I was there, is the ubiquitousness of technology. Lots of sort of games and sort of game show kinds of things with music going, and the students are all competing against one another, and then they get lollipops at the end. I mean, there's lots of, she's teaching language, so there was a lot of technology that was being used. So the last thing I wanted to say about this joyful picture of the Finland schools is that, by the way, I should have started off by saying this. There are no tests. There are no standardized tests along the way in Finland. There are final exams, which a lot of the teachers don't like the fact that there are final exams, but they're not, short answer tests. They're essay tests. The teachers create them together within the school. The byword of the Finnish schools is trust and autonomy. And this is just a picture of the hallway. There are no lockers. The kids just leave their stuff out and nobody steals it. There is a department of pastoral care in every Finnish school, and it's the department that focuses on the emotional and affective needs of the students. And when I was there, it was the week. They have different things each week that attend to the emotional needs of the students. the week that I was there, they put down mattresses one day all over the floors of the school, and everybody lay down on the mattresses and they played classical music. It was a rest and meditation day. So that's they're high up on the PISA. And you know what's interesting too is they've had so little experience taking standardized tests. They take the PISA test and they score at the top. So, but I chose Taiwan because it too was one of the very high-scoring countries on the PISA test. Again, within the top 5 every year on every measure. So here's a way to test out my thesis that about cultural respect and student performance. Taiwanese teachers are respected. They're respected within the culture. They're treated fairly. I can't say that it's a job that you're going to make a lot of money at, but again, you make as much money as other professionals do within the profession. There's difficult entry, as there was in Finland. There's cultural prestige, and again, as Sujin pointed out to me, it's a deeply embedded cultural prestige that goes back to Confucius. You know, it goes back to there's respect for teachers sort of embedded in the roots of the culture itself. But so there's cultural prestige, there's professional salary parity, but you go into a typical Taiwanese school, and I should say that all of the schools that I visited are sort of middle-class schools, for public schools, and it looks very different from, here's the outside of the school, I wrote, unadorned down to this. It's you know, actually there's beautiful foliage in the center of the school, beautiful trees that an earlier principal planted, but the school itself with the bars on the windows and the cement and the, you know, and there's really very little going on there of aesthetic interest. Typical classroom. It's a very traditional classroom and very traditional methods. In fact, in Feng Zhuan's class, she lectured from a raised podium with a microphone because the classes are so large, and the students sit in rows. They all dress in a kind of uniform, and then this is an art class. But everybody was painting the same thing. You know, and you can see the similarity of the top. It was consoling to see that the one thing that these two cultures had in common was this deep respect for the teaching profession and the difficult entry and the parity in salary, but the curriculum, the resources, everything else, all the stuff that we perseverate about here in the U.S. had made no difference, it seemed, in terms of, it was all about the teacher. The place that I just came back from is Athens, and Athens falls very low on the PISA tests. It's not completely at the bottom, Azerbaijan at the bottom, but it's down there. And so that was why I initially chose to go to Athens. But boy, did I learn a lot in Athens about the struggles of teaching around the world, the conditions of teaching. As you all know, there were these really draconian austerity measures that were imposed on the Greeks several years ago, starting I think 2012, and the greatest impact fell on the public school system. It was unbelievable what happened to the public school system. The teachers were programs were just cut. All the vocational programs were cut. All the arts were cut. All of the subordinate staff within the schools were cut. The janitors, the secretaries, all gone. The teachers' salaries were cut by 50%. 50%. The pensions were cut by 50%. So you can imagine what the morale was like in the school when I got there. And the other thing that made life very difficult, particularly for certain subject teachers, English, math, subjects where students had to pass the high-stakes test for, there had been erected a whole system of private schools in Greece, like cram schools in Japan and China, that any student with any kind of resources at all goes after school to these cram schools, these private cram schools. But as a result, once she gets her students in her English class, they really have no incentive to pay any attention because they go to the cram school and then they pass this requisite literacy test that you have, English literacy test that you have to take. Once they've passed it, there's nothing else that she can really teach them. I mean, she can teach them a lot, but they pay no attention because they're basically done. And so she's working against that as well. The behavior in the Greek schools was just beyond the pale. I mean, students were throwing things back and forth, and she was just talking to a couple of students in the front of the class who were paying any attention. The others, everybody was writing on the desks. And here she is cheerful, you know. And also, I mean, Vaso's salary, she was just unbelievable woman. She makes $850 a month. So that's like $12,000 a year for not only teaching all day long, and she teaches 5 classes, but also the teachers all now rotate into the janitorial and the secretarial work as well, so she's doing that work as well. And you can see, too, the meagerness of the resources. There's a sense of defeatedness is basically what it is. And I was lucky enough when I was there with her that it coincided with a big protest, pan-Hellenic, pan-education protest rally at the Parliament, which I attended with Vaso. There were constituents from all the different educational areas. So this was a group of high school students. Then there was a group of all the teachers who had been fired. Then there were university students. According to Vaso, these had been routine protests that were taking place, but that the response of the government had been so severe with tear gas and police that the numbers had dwindled. So by the time I went to this protest, there were maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people there. But she said there had been 20,000 to 30,000 at the beginning when the protest first began. So these are the questions that have begun to percolate for me. I mean, first is culture, if it's true that teachers the respect for teachers translates into student academic success, and that the respect for teachers is a cultural phenomenon, is that culture intractable? And I thought about Taiwan and what I said about Confucius and the whole respect for the elders and all of these aspects of the culture that are so profound and old, versus America, which has had since its founding a real suspicion of the work of teachers. This is not a new thing. This goes all the way back to the founding of the country and the glorification of the pioneer spirit and doing, not thinking. Those who can't do teach. When you think about all the aphorisms that go along with the teaching profession, they speak to a sort of deep cultural suspicion of what the teacher does. The other one is this inevitable question about economics. I mean, what role does economics play? Here we've got 2 very different responses in Finland and Greece to a financial crisis. One of them galvanized the education system in response to the recession. The other one just sucked all the money out. And then finally, of course, I'm thinking about the last chapter of the book. What can America learn from these other countries, if anything? I mean, whenever I speak to people about Finland, the first thing they always say is, yeah, but that's such a homogeneous country. Can you really compare Finland to the U.S.? My gut response is, yes, you can compare. And yes, you can learn lessons from these other countries. I'm just not clear yet on how you do it.